Tonight, as millions of eyes turn toward the Middle East, a single event has shaken the global order to its core. Russia's decisive and unforgiving move against Israel has not only redrawn the geopolitical map, it has ignited a storm of outrage, fear, and revelation. The question we must ask ourselves is not merely what happened, but why this moment was inevitable. This is not just an episode of military power, it is a reflection of decades of imbalance, arrogance, and unchecked imperial behavior that has finally met its reckoning. For years, the balance of power in the Middle East was dictated not by diplomacy or justice, but by brute influence, by superpowers manipulating nations like chess pieces on a global board. Israel, long seen as untouchable under the umbrella of Western protection, has now found itself cornered by the very forces it once dismissed. Russia's intervention is not born in a vacuum. It is a direct consequence of global frustration with the double standards that have defined international relations. The same nations that cry for peace often sell the weapons that wage these wars. The same voices that condemn aggression remain silent when it serves their interests. And tonight, that hypocrisy has been called to account. The global stage has entered a new era, an era where the balance of power no longer tilts effortlessly toward the West. The world that once moved to the rhythm of Washington and London now hesitates, recalculates, and watches as Moscow steps forward with an audacity unseen since the Cold War. Russia's decisive intervention against Israel marks not just a military move, but a declaration that the old rules no longer apply. For decades, the West has written the script of global politics, dictating who is right, who is wrong, and who must be punished. Yet in one sweeping act, Russia has torn that script apart and replaced it with something far more unpredictable: raw multipolar realism. The shock that ripples through capitals today is not about missiles or territory, it's about a shifting global center of gravity. What makes this moment historic is not simply Russia's show of force, but the symbolism embedded within it, the era of unilateral dominance, where Western nations acted as both judge and jury in international affairs, is collapsing under its own contradictions. For years, we've seen a pattern of selective morality, wars justified under the banner of democracy, invasions defended as humanitarian missions, sanctions disguised as justice. But when another power steps in and mirrors those very tactics against a Western ally, the outrage rings hollow. This is the great irony of global politics. The same behavior once celebrated as decisive leadership is suddenly condemned as aggression when it comes from the other side. And that hypocrisy is precisely what Russia is exploiting to announce a new world order. Behind every geopolitical move lies a deeper psychological game. Russia's strategy is not only to weaken Israel or challenge the West militarily, it's to erode the perception that the Western alliance is untouchable. The Kremlin understands that power is not just measured in weapons, but in narratives. By defying the global hierarchy, Russia has sent a message that resonates across continents: the age of Western exceptionalism is over. From Latin America to Africa, from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, nations long sidelined in global decision-making now see a different possibility emerging: a multipolar framework where influence is shared, not imposed. This transformation does not happen through diplomacy alone. It happens through moments like these, where one act of defiance reshapes the psychology of global politics. For policymakers in Washington and Brussels, the reaction has been one of disbelief cloaked in outrage. How could a single act so suddenly destabilize decades of Western dominance? Yet the signs were visible long before the first missile was launched. The gradual erosion of trust in Western-led institutions, the overuse of sanctions, and the endless military interventions that yielded chaos rather than peace, all contributed to the weakening of Western credibility. Russia has merely accelerated the inevitable reckoning. It understood that the moral authority of the West was already fractured, and it chose the perfect moment to exploit that fracture on the world stage. This is not a random act of aggression. It's a calculated power move aimed at redefining who gets to enforce global norms and who gets to defy them. What makes the situation even more compelling is the way the global audience has responded. Nations are not rushing to condemn Russia in unison as they once did. Instead, there is hesitation, a quiet reassessment. Leaders across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are weighing what this new balance means for them. Could this be the dawn of a new strategic freedom, one less dependent on Western approval? Could this moment finally break the monopoly of influence held by a few elite nations since the end of World War II? These are not academic questions anymore. They are urgent, existential calculations shaping the next phase of international politics. The old alliances that once defined security and order are beginning to look fragile, outdated, and irrelevant in a world that no longer trusts the narrative of Western superiority. In the end, what makes this geopolitical shockwave so powerful is its symbolism. It's not merely Russia stepping into conflict, it's the collapse of predictability itself. The illusion that one bloc could forever dominate the world has been shattered. What replaces it may be turbulent, uncertain, and at times dangerous, but it will be more balanced, more contested, and perhaps more honest. For the first time in decades, the West is no longer the sole architect of global order. The world is watching a power transition unfold, not quietly, not diplomatically, but through fire and force. And in that transformation, the message is unmistakable. History has turned a page, and no nation, no alliance, no empire can stop the momentum of change. Every geopolitical explosion begins with a fuse long left burning, and in this case, that fuse has been smoldering for decades. The events unfolding between Russia and Israel are not a spontaneous eruption of hostility. They are the product of years of unresolved injustice, political arrogance, and global indifference. What we are witnessing today is the world finally collecting the bill for its silence. The roots of this crisis run deep, buried beneath years of hypocrisy and selective morality that allowed one nation to act beyond consequence while others suffered under the weight of unrelenting scrutiny. When the balance of justice is distorted for too long, when one side is granted impunity while another is condemned for resistance, the eventual backlash becomes not only inevitable but explosive. Israel's conduct over the past decades, its occupation of Palestinian territories, its disregard for countless United Nations resolutions, and its unrelenting military aggressions was tolerated by much of the world under the guise of strategic necessity. Western powers defended every strike, justified every blockade, and muted every criticism in the name of self-defense. But the world is no longer blind to the double standards that underpin these narratives. The same powers that once demanded accountability from others refused to impose it on their closest ally. Russia's intervention, as ruthless as it may appear, taps into that growing resentment. It is less an isolated act of aggression and more a political statement. a declaration that the era of untouchable nations is ending. This moment is not just about Israel and Russia. It's about the moral bankruptcy of the international system that allowed such tensions to fester unchecked. The United Nations, designed as a beacon of balance and justice, has too often been paralyzed by the veto power of the few. Western democracies, once seen as defenders of fairness, have been exposed as selective advocates of peace, speaking loudly when it suits their interests and falling silent when their allies commit transgressions. The consequence of that silence is now manifesting in ways that even the most powerful can no longer control. Russia, aware of these fractures, is exploiting them with strategic precision. By positioning itself as the avenger of neglected injustices, Moscow is not only expanding its geopolitical reach, it is claiming moral leverage that the West has long lost. There's an undeniable irony in how this narrative unfolds. For years, the global community watched conflict after conflict erupt across the Middle East. Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, each one met with the same pattern: outrage, condemnation, and then forgetfulness. Humanitarian crises became political bargaining chips, and peace became a slogan rather than a goal. Now, as the situation escalates into something far greater, those years of apathy have come full circle. Every unheeded warning, every dismissed peace effort, every ignored report of suffering has accumulated into this moment of reckoning. Russia's intervention is the shockwave of moral neglect that the world itself enabled. The streets across the globe are responding differently this time, from Cairo to Istanbul, from Johannesburg to Jakarta. There is a sense of vindication mixed with fear. Many nations that have long criticized Western hypocrisy are now watching a power finally challenge it directly. While they may not endorse Russia's methods, they understand the sentiment behind them. The oppressed and the overlooked see in this conflict a mirror of their own frustrations, a defiance against a global hierarchy that has silenced their pain for too long. That emotional current is what makes this crisis so volatile, so unpredictable, and so historically significant. The world is not just witnessing a geopolitical battle, it is witnessing the moral consequences of decades of selective justice. In truth, this was never just a question of politics, it was a question of principle. How long can a world claim to champion human rights while ignoring human suffering? How long can global powers speak of peace while arming wars? The hypocrisy has stretched too far, and now it is snapping. Russia has seized that moment, transforming itself from an observer of global injustice into an unpredictable actor that demands attention. The international community, caught between outrage and recognition, now faces a reality it long avoided when justice is denied. Power will always find a way to fill the vacuum, and in that vacuum, the flames of consequence burn brightest, not only for those directly involved, but for the entire world that allowed injustice to thrive unchecked. The world of diplomacy, once anchored by predictability and quiet negotiation, has been thrust into chaos. The recent escalation has not only upended the fragile balance of power in the Middle East, but has also shattered the illusions upon which global alliances were built. Nations that once believed themselves safeguarded by treaties and Western protection now find themselves adrift in uncertainty. Russia's unexpected and brutal intervention has exposed the hollowness of many strategic promises, forcing world leaders to confront an uncomfortable truth. The global order is no longer held together by trust, but by fear. What was once a world of stable alliances has transformed into a volatile arena where loyalty is conditional, alliances are transactional, and power is once again the ultimate currency. For decades, Western diplomacy operated under a veneer of control. The United States and its allies projected an image of invincibility, presenting themselves as guardians of order and peace. Countries aligned themselves accordingly, believing that partnership with the West ensured protection and prosperity. Yet this moment of upheaval has revealed the fragility of that illusion. Israel, long seen as a linchpin of Western power in the Middle East, is now facing a crisis that no ally seems willing or able to resolve decisively. Washington's responses, cautious and calculated, expose a hesitation that is new to the global stage. The certainty that once defined American foreign policy has eroded, replaced by strategic fatigue and internal divisions. For Russia, this hesitation was an opening too large to ignore. The Kremlin understands that power vacuums are created not only through military weakness, but through diplomatic hesitation. By stepping into the chaos with boldness, Russia has sent a message that reverberates beyond the battlefield. It has demonstrated that action, even brutal action, now defines legitimacy. The West's slow and fragmented response exposes a deeper issue. The old alliances that once operated with near-perfect synchronization are faltering under the weight of conflicting interests. Europe, struggling with economic instability and public disillusionment, no longer stands as united as its leaders claim. Meanwhile, nations in Asia and the Middle East are recalibrating, sensing the decline of Western dominance and the rise of a new geopolitical rhythm, one in which no power holds permanent control. This shift is not only political, it's psychological. Countries that once felt invisible are beginning to see opportunity in uncertainty. Regional powers like Turkey, Iran, and even China are watching closely, aware that the cracks in the Western-led order could become gateways to greater influence. The notion of a fixed global hierarchy is dissolving before our eyes. Instead, diplomacy is evolving into a game of adaptability, where nations are judged not by their alliances, but by their ability to maneuver through chaos. Russia's assertiveness, though condemned by many, is being studied by even more. It is a demonstration of how power can be seized through audacity when others hesitate to act. The irony lies in how quickly perception has shifted. Just a few years ago, Russia was dismissed as a destabilizing force on the periphery of global politics, isolated by sanctions and political condemnation. Now, through one ruthless act, it has forced every major capital to rethink its assumptions. The United States finds itself having to defend its credibility, while European leaders scramble to maintain unity. In corridors of power from Paris to Riyadh, the question is no longer, what will Russia do next? But how do we protect ourselves if the old order truly collapses? Diplomats are realizing that the treaties and partnerships they once took pride are only as strong as the will to enforce them. And that will is rapidly fading. Behind closed doors, the tension is palpable. Governments that once relied on Western assurances are quietly diversifying their alliances, holding discreet talks with powers they once opposed. The unspoken acknowledgement is that the West can no longer guarantee protection, only promises. In the past, Western support was a deterrent. Now it feels like a gamble. And as confidence in those traditional alliances wanes, the world edges closer to a new diplomatic reality, one defined by self-interest rather than shared ideology. The Middle East, in particular, has become a laboratory for this transformation. Nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are carefully balancing between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, ensuring they will survive regardless of who claims dominance next. The shattering of diplomatic illusions has a ripple effect that extends far beyond the battlefield. The credibility of global institutions, the unity of long-standing alliances, and the moral authority of the West all now hang in the balance. The new question shaping foreign policy discussions worldwide is brutally simple. Who can actually deliver security in a world where words have lost their weight? Russia's intervention may have unleashed chaos, but it also unveiled the truth that many preferred to ignore. Diplomacy built on dominance is fragile, and when fear replaces faith, even the most established alliances begin to crumble. The true shock of this crisis extends far beyond the battlefield. It reverberates through financial markets, diplomatic chambers, and the very psyche of global stability. When Russia moved decisively against Israel, the tremors were not confined to the Middle East. They spread instantly across continents, shaking the foundations of economies, unsettling investors, and sending world leaders into emergency meetings behind closed doors. The suddenness of the event stripped away the illusion that globalization had insulated nations from geopolitical chaos. Instead, it revealed how deeply entangled the world truly is, and how one act of aggression can disrupt the delicate web of interdependence that binds us all. The markets did not simply react, they panicked. Oil prices soared, global stock indices faltered, and the security of entire industries came into question. It was a moment that reminded the world that geopolitics is not abstract. It is economic gravity, pulling everything into its orbit. The immediate response from investors and institutions was driven by fear, not logic. Capital fled from volatile regions, currencies dipped, and the price of energy surged to levels not seen in years. For nations already burdened by inflation and debt, this escalation felt like a thunderstorm over already flooded ground. But the economic fallout is only the surface of a deeper psychological shock. The belief that major conflicts could be contained or predicted has evaporated. What Russia's move exposed is that the international system, once praised for its stability, is far more fragile than leaders admit. The promise of perpetual peace under a globalized economy now feels like a distant dream, replaced by a growing recognition that markets and politics are no longer separate spheres. They are one and the same. The psychological impact of unpredictability is far more corrosive than any material loss. Investors can price risk. They cannot price chaos. For decades, the global economy was built on the assumption that Western power would ensure order, that any major disruption would be swiftly contained by diplomacy or force. That confidence has been shattered. Russia's defiance signals to the world that no nation, no market, and no alliance is truly immune from shock. The psychological shift is profound. Uncertainty has become the new norm. The sense of control that once underpinned global finance and trade has been replaced with anxiety, and that anxiety is contagious. It seeps into policymaking, corporate strategy, and public sentiment alike. Governments, too, are scrambling to adjust. Emergency energy summits are being convened, central banks are reassessing interest rate paths, and defense spending debates are intensifying across Europe and Asia. Every country now understands that the economic consequences of war are no longer regional. They are systemic. Energy markets have become the front line of conflict, and nations dependent on imports find themselves suddenly vulnerable. Russia, as a major energy player, wields this leverage with precision, weaponizing supply chains and manipulating markets to amplify its influence. The West, for all its financial sophistication, finds itself reacting rather than leading, its institutions struggling to contain the fallout of its own complacency. In households across the world, this geopolitical quake is not felt in headlines but in the cost of living. Rising fuel prices, disrupted trade routes, and currency instability all translate into one simple reality: life becomes more expensive, and trust in leadership declines. People begin to question not just policies, but the entire structure of global governance. How could the world, with all its technological and diplomatic prowess, allow itself to be thrown into disarray so swiftly? This disillusionment deepens the crisis, transforming economic instability into political volatility. Populism gains new oxygen. Protests intensify, and leaders find themselves navigating a storm of public anger fueled by both fear and confusion. The institutions that once served as anchors, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, suddenly appear reactive rather than proactive. Their statements carry less authority, their interventions less impact. The global order, once a carefully choreographed dance of diplomacy and markets, now looks like a fractured mirror, each region reflecting a different version of truth, each leader pursuing self-preservation over cooperation. Russia's move has exposed not only the weaknesses of the West, but also the fragility of the system it built. It has reminded the world that globalization, for all its promises, cannot escape the gravitational pull of power politics. The deeper consequence of this shock lies in what it does to collective confidence. The idea that global stability is a given, that economies can expand endlessly under the protection of predictable governance, has been irreparably damaged. Markets can recover, but trust is harder to rebuild. The world now stands at the edge of an economic and psychological transformation, one in which fear replaces faith as the central force driving global behavior. Russia's strike against Israel was not just a military maneuver, it was a test of the world's resilience. And as markets tremble, currencies weaken, and alliances fracture, one truth has become undeniable. The global system built on illusion has finally met its reckoning. In closing, let me leave you with this. History never ends, it transforms. What began as a geopolitical shock will soon become a philosophical reckoning. Nations will rethink their alliances, citizens will question their media, and economies will tremble under the uncertainty of a shifting world order. But out of this chaos, there is an opportunity, a chance to rebuild international relations not on dominance, but on dignity, not on threats, but on truth. The world is in shock tonight, yes, but sometimes it takes a shock to awaken humanity from its sleep. Thank you.